afternoon, and thank you for joining our program. I hope everyone has their tea ready as we pay homage to the suffragists who organized tea parties for their cause and even branded their own tea called Equality. This is going to be an inspirational and informative discussion today. I'm Commissioner Cara C. I've had the pleasure of serving on the Florida Commission on the Status of Women for the last 3 years, and I'm a board member of the Executive Committee. Created in 1991, the Commission is a nonpartisan body comprised of 22 commissioners who focus on raising awareness and celebrating the contributions and successes of women. The Commission hosts community conversations, educational forums, and seminars on issues impacting the lives of women. If you would like to know more about the Commission, please visit our website at fcsw.net. Part of the Commission's mission is to recognize and celebrate women's history, and it presents us the opportunity to recognize and celebrate the many ways that women's history has become woven into the fabric of our state and national story. The courageous vision championed by women of past generations inspires us to defend the dreams and opportunities of those to come. 2020 marks the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment, which allows U.S. citizens to vote regardless of sex. For 70 years, women throughout the United States organized and petitioned at the state and national levels for their right to vote. And on August 18, 1920, U.S. women won a huge battle with the ratification of the 19th Amendment in Tennessee. Joining us today to share and highlight some of the history of the suffrage movement are two very distinguished experts, Tiffany Baker and Rachel Bassan Porter, both from the Florida Historic Capitol Museum. Rachel Bassan Porter is the Director of Research and Programming at the Florida Historic Capitol Museum, where she is responsible for the strategic development of exhibitions and collections care, as well as special events and programming. Prior to her employment with the museum, Rachel held multiple roles with the Florida Department of State. Between 2008 and 2017, she was Senior Archaeologist with the Bureau of Archaeological Research, Special Programs Coordinator with the Secretary of State's Office, where she was Lead Coordinator for the Viva Florida 500 project and editor of the Florida Administrative Code and Register. Rachel is an accomplished writer whose work with First Lady Ann Scott was featured at the 2018 National Book Fair in Washington, D.C. Originally from Houston, Texas, Rachel spent many years living overseas. She's from a diverse family and is a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. She's married to a fifth-generation Floridian and has 2 daughters, a stepson, and a grandson. Welcome, Rachel. Tiffany Baker is a public historian and community advocate with almost 2 decades in the field. She currently serves as the director of the Florida Historic Capitol Museum and was first appointed to that role by Senate President and House Speaker in 2014. Prior to her time as director, she was head of the Florida Legislative Research Center and held positions at cultural institutions, including the Tallahassee Trust for Historic Preservation and the Jewish Historical Society of Greater Washington. Tiffany was awarded her master's in historical administration and public history from FSU and her bachelor's in history from American University. She is an active volunteer serving on local and statewide boards. In all of her roles, Tiffany hopes to foster strong and engaged communities by demonstrating the importance of connecting the past to our future path through strategic preservation initiatives and innovative programming. She lives in Tallahassee with her historian husband, Jonathan. Welcome to you both. I now turn the program over to you so that you can show us some of the highlights of the Rightfully Hers exhibit.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Perry and Kelly, for inviting us today to talk about the Rightfully Hers exhibit and share this experience with you. I'm going to show my screen now, and hopefully it will work. Does it look good, Rachel? Okay. It helps to have a partner in crime when we're doing a presentation like this to back me up. So thank you so much for having us here this morning. And to start off the presentation today, the first thing that we wanted to do was to show you the beautiful Florida Historic Capitol Museum. For those of you who are visiting with us today from around the state who may have not had the opportunity to visit this building, we're just wanted to show you what it looked like and to share this space with you. It is the 1902 Historic Capitol building. It has been restored to its 1902 look and opened as a museum in 1982. Since that time, we have served as the state's Museum of Political History, and not just that as a museum, but we are also, as you could see from the video about the commission, a place where Floridians gather to participate in the civic process. And so it is an honor to share the state's political history, as well as offer this opportunity to have your voice heard and participate in the civic process every single day. And so our mission is to really connect the people of Florida, our visitors more broadly, with the political institutions of Florida through programs of historic interpretation, civic education, and preservation. And so we accomplish all of that by providing stewardship for the historic 1902 building that has 4 restored spaces that show you the history or provide an opportunity to immerse yourself in the history of the 3 branches of government, but also to look at thematic exhibits that expand beyond just the history of the 3 branches and look at the issues that affect and interest Floridians every single day. And so some of the other thematic exhibits you may see relate to taxation, immigration, education, racism and segregation, elections, and voting. So issues like the 19th Amendment are very dear to our mission here at the Historic Capitol. And so because of that, we have spent some time over the last 2 years commemorating the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment and everything that went into the passage and then ratification of the amendment over many, many years. And the next slide that I've just pulled up shows you kind of the beginning of our commemorative festivities here at the Historic Capitol, when in 2019 we were the premier institution in the country for the exhibit that you see here on the screen, One Half of the People, Advancing Equality for Women. And that was a National Archives traveling exhibition that was a wonderful opportunity for us to look at the history of the suffrage movement, but so much more. And one of the reasons that we selected One Half of the People and pursued it with the National Archives a number of years ago was that it expanded the commonly accepted narrative of suffrage that really focused on a few big names in a few key moments. And it moved beyond that and showed that suffrage was not a single moment where women's right to vote was turned from off to on, but instead it was a much more complex history, and the exhibit examined some of those issues. It focused on many women who were involved in the movements, for example, the abolitionist movement that happened before the sort of traditional narrative of the suffrage movement, and then after suffrage, and acknowledged the wide breadth of issues that were addressed by women in the different ways that they participate in the civic process, even today. It went all the way up into the 1980s and looked at 20th century reforms that addressed the ability of women to be able to open a bank account or obtain credit to purchase a home without having to have a male member of their household or family to advocate for them. And so it just really expanded that narrative. The 3 photos that you see in the slide today show you some of the key elements that illustrated that scope of the narrative. There were profiles and historic documents related to a number of notable women, which is what you see in the left-hand side there, the women that were highlighted, as well as the documents next to them. Oversized historic photographs that featured key moments, again, beyond suffrage. For example, the photograph that you see in the exhibit in the center there is the torch runners and activists as they arrived at the National Women's Conference in 1977. And then there was a reflection area where we asked visitors to kind of take into account everything that they had read in the exhibit and to reflect on their own participation in the civic process. How could they be an engaged citizen, and what did they hope to accomplish over the years of the commemoration? And it was just a wonderful opportunity to kind of open the door at the moment of passage, the 100th anniversary, and start our commemorative experience. Rightfully Hers and the offer to borrow artifacts from the books expanded our ability to participate in the commemoration into the ratification year of 2020. And so now we're going to explore some of the artifacts from that exhibit and share some of the stories that relate to the suffrage movement so that you can get a feel for the exhibit even though you can't visit with us right now. Right. All right, so the first item, the first document that you see from the Rightfully Hers exhibit is an artifact that is known as a suffrage map, or commonly called a victory map. And the suffrage map that you see here is from 1919, so right on the cusp of ratification. And these documents are significant because they are used by the suffragists in the movement to show some of the successes, but also maybe what else needs to come. So let's spend just a moment looking at the map together. I want you to take a few moments to kind of check out the key along the bottom and look at the different patterns that are depicted so that you can understand a little bit more about the broader picture that you're seeing there with the map. What it is showing and what's important, especially to this discussion today, is that the traditional narrative, again, is that prior to the suffrage movement, women just didn't have the right to vote. And then after the 19th Amendment, they did. But again, the documents, the letters that you read, the various legal decisions and legislation that's passed in individual states, and documents like this map show that the story is more nuanced. Not only did women have the ability to vote in some way and in some places in many states prior to the passage of the amendment, in some states, some women have full suffrage and can vote in general elections and elections from the bottom all the way to the top. It does reveal, however, how it could be difficult to organize around the idea of suffrage when there are layers of implementation throughout the years. So when you're looking at the map and you're seeing all of the different opportunities that are being provided to women in different places around the country, you can understand that when there is an advocacy for a national amendment, that some states, some women in some states, some men too, remember, they're voting on these issues and ultimately would be involved with the passage of the amendment. It's hard to convince them to all get behind a national amendment when in some states women already have that right. So how do you get someone from, Wyoming or Montana to care about what's happening to women in Ohio and in the South? It's very complicated and it's difficult and it requires very complex communication networks that develop and advanced strategies for conveying their ideas. And Rachel will get into some of that in just a little bit in terms of messaging. But so this map really kind of depicts this. The other thing that we should note when looking at this map and some other documents is that we have to consider the use of the word women as broadly applying to everyone. So while the term appears all-inclusive and the assumption would be perhaps that the right to vote was then equally available to all women as soon as the 19th Amendment passed, or in these states even where they did have the right to vote in some elections prior to the 19th Amendment, we have to acknowledge that the movement itself was segregated and the implementation of the 19th Amendment was also segregated and divisive. So in many states, Jim Crow laws and other legislation enabled governments after the passage of the 19th Amendment to formally withhold the vote from and discourage female voters long after passage. The numbers 2 on the map reflect only women who had been counted as citizens of the United States by the 1910 census. So that's another layer to this story. The story of suffrage is also a story about citizenship. A majority of Native Americans across the nation had not been recognized as citizens of the US by this time. And additionally, American-born women who married non-citizen men lost their citizenship. And that happened all the way up to 1922 after the passage of the amendment. Recent immigrants were excluded from the suffrage count, as well as denied the right to vote after the passage. And again, there were additional barriers that I already mentioned with the Jim Crow laws, such as making access to the vote contingent on the ability to read or write, or your financial ability to pay a poll tax. Those laws were very prominent after 1920 and were very radically enforced, and were legal ways that states could restrain the right to vote after expanding it. So if everyone could not vote in every election, so prior to the passage of the 19th Amendment, and then later after, but prior to the passage of the 19th Amendment, how were they able then to count the votes in a way that was accurate and to keep them separate? We actually have an artifact in the exhibit that provides the answer to that question. On the next slide that I just pulled up, what you see here is, if you can see, it's a little bit difficult to see because of the dark color of the artifact itself, but it is a ballot box emblazoned with the words women's ballots on it. So again, as suffrage in a few states was possible for women, they could only vote sometimes in a few elections. So this common practice necessitated a separation of votes. And so this is how they did it. Women would cast their ballots and they would be separated into separate boxes. This particular ballot box was produced by St. Louis-based stationery company George G. Bernard. And one thing that is particularly interesting about this box and its origins in its manufacture in Missouri is that Missouri was one of the few states where well, not one of the few, from the beginning, one of the many that explicitly franchised only men in its constitution. So maybe there wasn't a need for the ballot box there at the beginning. Okay, moving on to the next artifact. The one that you see here on this slide is one of my favorites and sets the tone too for the rest of our discussion today, or for a lot of our discussion today with Rachel, is that it is a banner that as you walk up the hallway towards the exhibit, you are greeted by it. And it is eye-catching, and that is intentional. What we are trying to do with the banner, and ultimately with many of the artifacts in the exhibit, is to center the visitor's focus on imagery and messaging, and how the message of the movement and the message against the movement was conveyed in various ways. So we're looking at depictions that are both positive and negative. Now, you may consider that the pervasive nature of political propaganda and the way that it bleeds into our everyday lives, you may feel like you're constantly confronted with the idea of politics or the election or voting as a modern convention, that it only happens now. Or maybe you might think that it's something that was created by those really strong advertising firms of the 1950s and 60s, you know, kind of picture Mad Men a little bit in New York. But the reality of it is that when you study the fight for suffrage, it reveals how political messaging in a very early period was designed to influence individual ideology and preference while consumer culture was emerging, particularly in the United States, but also in the UK. And so what's happening is that mass production of consumables is occurring. We are buying and consuming publications, clothing, accessories, food, household goods. And what is happening is that the messaging related to suffrage is being tied to the consumption of these materials, and it becomes ubiquitous. This is a big industry during the suffrage movement, and Rachel will show you some other examples of that in just a minute. But this is just one of them. Nina Allender was a cartoonist for the National Women's Party. They produced 2 magazines, The Suffragist and then later Equal Rights, and they included her images as a way to try to combat the negative imagery that was being created against the suffrage movement. In her materials, like this one, you will see a positive image of a suffragist. Typically, it's a young woman Often she is well dressed. Sometimes she evokes a historic character like a Greek goddess or someone who would have been a powerful woman in history. So that happens. Ultimately, she is attractive and she looks powerful and her message is powerful. You are supposed to feel positively about this. And Nina Allender's materials were not just published in the publications that they had, those two, the Suffragists and Equal Rights. They printed them and used them on posters, for example, like this one would have been, and distributed widely to their members and other supporters. So you're seeing these images and reinforcing your perception as suffragists as a powerful woman. Now, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. So maybe I'm looking at this and I think, wow, this woman looks incredibly powerful. But you may be looking at this and thinking, well, she isn't wearing, sensible shoes. So really, how effective was she? I bet they're probably comfortable heels. I'll believe that. But so it's hard to interpret these images sometimes, and you bring your biases to the table, or you sometimes are being misled. That's the intention of the image. And so now I'm going to turn the presentation over to Rachel and let her kind of break down some of this messaging with you so that you can consider it a little more deeply as we look at the suffrage history. So Rachel, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Tiffany. And I'm going to leave you firmly in the controls there, just for our transition over to our poll. And in fact, if we can also launch a poll as we go to the next slide, I want to start some interaction with our audience today. In a moment, I am going to share one of the postcards in the Rightfully Hers exhibit. And I want you to tell me on the poll, if that can come out. Here we go. Is that postcard pro or anti-suffrage? What do you think? And are we ready with some answers for who believes that is pro or anti? I am able to see that most of you all believe that is an anti-suffrage message. Well, you're right, it is anti-suffrage. It's not entirely clear, and 31% of you saw that maybe it isn't. And so you can see what Tiffany was saying, beauty is in the eye of the beholder there. This postcard actually kind of looks a little bit like my house over the last few weeks of teaching elementary school digital academy. But at the time that this was created in the early 1900s, it really was an outrageous idea that a father could willingly take on these kinds of responsibilities, things that had been established over years for women's work. Women had always been the child caretakers, etc. And that was established pretty well in the US and in the UK there. So speaking to those social norms of the era, it flips them on their head. And that anticipates our negative response to that. So that's really what it's going for. The woman is here, she's walking away. He's left to take care of all of these things. And the idea being sent out there by the anti-suffragists, which is expressing the fears of many men. Oh, we've jumped ahead. Thank you. So many men were in the anti-suffrage camp, as well as many women, really trying to say that if women are away fighting for their right to vote, if they're even out there in the political arena at all, or even just outside of the home, that chaos is going to ensue. They're going to neglect their duties at home, leaving men to be the main caretakers for their children, and then solely responsible for all of these domestic duties. And I just remark, interesting, there was a recent Gallup poll that went out this year, and it shows that over half of women in the United States that are in heterosexual relationships are responsible for doing traditionally women's work still, like cleaning, childcare, cooking in their households, and that is in addition to working outside of their home. So when we think back to how these fears were out there that women would neglect their duties, interestingly, that clearly has not happened. So if we go to the other side of this image, we've looked at a lot of these pro and anti-suffrage postcards. And our exhibits manager, Michelle Sunset, who worked on Rightfully Hers, devised this flow chart. And that's actually available to you to download in the handout section on this webinar. And it's designed to help our visitors understand whether these images are in favor or opposed to women's suffrage, as it's not always clear. So using the chart today on this postcard, we could start in a couple of different places, honestly, but if we just start with women, it asks, of course, so what do we see? Women. How are they portrayed? Well, she's well dressed, she's smiling, she's happy, it's pretty positive. So we'll say positively. Then it asks if she's shown as royalty. Well, she is actually wearing an ermine fur stoat and a pretty elaborate hat. We know that this postcard was produced in the UK and it was sent to the US as an item for the consumer market in the United States. But yes, you know, royalty did wear these items. That we'd say, yes, she was portrayed as royalty. And then you go down and it says, the flowchart says that this is in fact an we probably think it's anti-suffrage. And actually you come to the same conclusion if you look at the line there with men. He is doing domestic work or childcare there. He doesn't look particularly happy about it. So again, we're confirming this is probably anti-suffrage. So if we go to the next postcard, we're going to try it out again using the flow chart. This one votes for, well, women, maybe. It's another style that was common in the early 20th century, showing a child as a part of a suffrage campaign. So she's here dressed up as a general. Now remember, that time, women were not permitted in the military. They were in supporting roles as medics, nurses, etc. But the use of childish imagery on some of these cards was really attempting to belittle women. They're playing at being in a man's world with the idea of women's suffrage. And so this one's a little more explicit because you have the W and the O crossed out, leaving the phrase to read votes for men. And you consult the chart. Okay, so we're going to go down the children aisle there. And what does it say? Votes for women, but is it correctly spelled? Last time I checked, women was not spelled M-E-N. So therefore, this card is probably anti-suffrage. Okay, so, and another one, the next slide, please. And in fact, our next poll. So this is your opportunity to try out for yourselves if this particular card with children is pro or anti-suffrage, and give you a chance to look at it a little bit there. And then if we could launch the poll and see how we're getting along here. How are we doing on getting our pro and anti-suffrage decoding skills going? Okay, just a moment there. Okay, can we go ahead and see the results of our poll? Half and half, almost exactly. That's pretty interesting. And you know, you're not wrong. I did just point out about children being often used to belittle women. But on this particular one, if we use the chart, so the young girl there is painting votes for women while also she's standing there on the Votes for Women platform. So is it spelled correctly? Yes, yes it is. And so it's probably pro-suffrage, but to explore it a little bit deeper, this young girl in the middle of an act of civil disobedience, with the amazement of these two little boys looking on, she's saying at the top, lend thy influence to each effort that shall raise our nature human. And this is reference to a child's poem from the 1860s that is titled Be a Woman. And that poem urges mothers to raise their daughters not to be fashion's gilded lady, but instead to be a, quote, brave, whole-souled woman. And with that in the background, and many people of the time maybe knowing this poem, the children's allegory for women's immaturity, that all falls away. And so it really is about playfulness, of using images of children. You know, they're very innocent. They are our future. And so they do appear on the pro-suffrage postcards as well. Here, instead of using them to belittle, they're non-threatening, and they're sharing that message of women's suffrage. Which then brings us to our next card, which is in the same vein, same spirit. And I'm sharing it not only because it really is a great example of suffrage holiday cards, which there were a lot of those, but it does share a very important detail about the role that men played in the movement and the passage of the 19th Amendment. So the little girl here is giving her Valentine heart to the little boy holding a Votes for Women banner, and it is spelled correctly. And that postcard actually originally included the words "My Hero" written in gold on that large big heart at the background. It's been modified probably before it was sent. This one was sent in time for Valentine's Day of 1920. But you know, very few women could use their voices at the ballot box at that time. So men really were an integral part of this movement. They were the ones at the end of the day who would sway the votes in favor of the amendment. So this little boy who's marching in favor of suffrage is really the kind of hero that the suffragists needed to have on their side. So we'll go to the next slide. After talking about so many postcards, you know, there were other ways that these messages were shared, including buttons that were produced and distributed widely. This gold and navy Votes for Women button was really common. There were over 1 million of those distributed in New York City in 1917. And the anti-suffrage message as well was distributed on buttons. This one that you see was produced by either the Massachusetts Association opposed to the further extension of suffrage, or it may have also been from the National Association opposed to women's suffrage. Both of those organizations were fairly prominent, and some of the Massachusetts efforts did end up with the National Association. All of those buttons were produced through a really simple method, and that stamper in the middle shows how that was done. It is a carved wooden block, and it would have been coated with some navy blue ink. And then that was stamped onto the circular gold paper, just like on that Votes for Women button. And then that circular print was wrapped with celluloid and put around a metal backing with a pin in it. And the gold and navy equal suffrage button was made as part of an effort in Ohio to make them the 6th state to pass the referendum. So that's why it has 6 stars. And just incidentally, that one didn't pass, and California was the 6th state to pass a law that allowed some women to vote in 1911. Okay, the next slide, please. Okay, so this is a triangular yellow pennant. It's quite large, and it may have been used by suffragists to hang from a window or balcony, or it could have been connected to a pole in the back and used during protests, processions, marches, that kind of thing. One of the most famous suffrage marches in the US was the 1913 Women's Suffrage Procession in Washington, D.C. That was organized by the National Women's Suffrage Association. A lot of purple, a lot of yellow and white flags and pennants just like this one were really prominent at that parade. Women from organizations all across the country participated in that parade. And I think here is important to mention, again, that there were several struggles that were happening within the American suffrage movement, now almost from the very beginning, but they did really play out during the 1913 procession. Those divisions, they fell along class and racial lines, and the most significant rift came directly from Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who were 2 women that are commonly heralded as the founders of the suffrage movement. In the late 1800s, they were seeking to block the 15th Amendment to the Constitution. That amendment states that the right of citizens in the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on the account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Despite their protests, that amendment went into effect in 1870. The most commonly shared history of the suffrage movement really explains how many white middle class upper middle class and upper class women sought suffrage equality with their white male counterparts. And there's really been less focus on the fight that minority women exercised in seeking equality with white women as well as with men. So the 1913 parade gives us a little glimpse of that internal struggle around race. And actually, to learn more about that, if you are interested, I would suggest that you go to the recording of the last suffrage tea time with Drs. Austin and Dr. Robertson Preston. That was on August 18th with the Commission on the Status of Women, and I believe that is on their website. It's a really fantastic talk. So we'll go on to the next slide. And this very cool ribbon pin shows that the vote was cast, likely by a woman, November 2nd, 1920. So on August 26, 1920, after 36 states, which does not include Florida, ratified the congressional amendment, the 19th Amendment to the Constitution became law. And I quote, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex." So then on election day, November 2nd, 1920, so many new voters headed out to the polls, and it really was a moment of victory and an end to the long fight for some. But for many, it was the beginning. And really, just to say it again, that milestone did not enfranchise every woman. The 19th Amendment did not flip a switch. And actually, the 1920 election is testament to that fact. This election is known in history as the bloody election of 1920. And that is because there were many atrocities against African-American voters across the country, but particularly in the South. They came from a place of fear, these attacks. Many of the white supremacist male-dominated Democratic Party leaders would lose their power and they would be replaced with Republicans. That is the party of Lincoln. There was a great fear of this change. Incidentally, the Republican president here, Warren Harding, he did take the White House that year. And many did believe that the 1920 19th Amendment passage was part of that change. So in Ocoee, to bring it to Florida, Election Day, November 2nd, 1920, is remembered as the day of the Ocoee Massacre. And that is a day of extreme violence, including murder committed by residents who sought to deter the African-American community from voting. And that ultimately led to the mass exodus of many people in the community from Ocoee, from Orange County more broadly. And so although the long fight for women's suffrage had a major victory with the passage of the 19th Amendment, it really was not the end by any means. So the last postcard, last artifact that I want to talk about today is going to highlight this cargo company issued Think It Over postcard. This was produced in part with the National American Women's Suffrage Association and is what some scholars of the era would call an official card. Looks very official. It speaks for itself. There's no hidden agenda here. It was produced as a set. There were 15 different postcards in that set, and 2 sets of those were produced around 1910. It's an important artifact, I think, because it tells us a little bit about this long road that we've been talking about, the long road traveled towards equality in American democracy. In 1910, when the postcard was printed, the National American Women's Suffrage Association was already a 30-year-old organization. They were aware that they had already got a lot of momentum by 1910, and the change in voting laws and the social changes that would then follow, they did realize that is going to be a multi-generational shift. And so they needed the next generation to move this into the next stage. So educating the entire family, including children, so that they have an intelligent understanding of the suffrage issue would continue that. And again, to make mention of the last suffrage tea time, Dr. Robertson Preston said in that talk, she explained that constantly pushing the bar so that the next person coming up can push it further was really an important strategy for suffragists and also for the civil rights movement as a whole. multi-generational nature of these massive social shifts is really pretty significant. So in that regard, it's possible to see how this postcard does in fact remain relevant even today. So I'm really happy to have been able to share a few of these artifacts with you all. I'm really grateful to Senator Lauren Book and Mr. Ron Book for loaning us those artifacts for Rightfully Hers, and also to the Commission for organizing this program today. I'm going to turn it back over to Tiffany just for a couple of closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel, and I just want to echo Rachel's sentiments to the books for loaning the artifacts. It has just made the exhibit even that much richer in terms of content. And this is the final, just kind of the poster for the exhibit, and we would love for you to explore it a little bit more with WFSU. They did a 360 tour with us that I think is about 7 minutes long with Rachel, and you can learn a little bit more about some of the other artifacts in the exhibit. So we're so grateful to have the opportunity to share these moments with you and exhibits like this, because it provides the opportunity to have those conversations like Rachel was referring to with that final postcard, that are so necessary for us to continue to move forward and engage the newest generations in the civic process. So it's such a valuable opportunity. We look forward to having the questions and discussion.
Thank you so much, Tiffany and Rachel. That was a fascinating presentation, and the artifacts and visuals you presented really helped make this very important story come to life. We do have a few questions for you. One that came up first is, what is your theory on why states started allowing women to vote when our country was formed, but then rescinded that right in the early 1800s?
Thank you, Commissioner Perry, for that question. So yes, that's one of the kind of exciting developments that happened as a result of this deep dive into women's suffrage that historians have been doing now probably for the last 5 or 10 years, was the discovery of some women voting in New Jersey. There was a voting block, I think over the course of a few years, about 146 votes were cast by what they believe by women. And what had happened essentially was that it's a complex answer, not just in New Jersey, and Rachel will speak to this more. There's at least one other state where this happened, where voting rights were expanded and then rescinded. Essentially, the people in power, especially in New Jersey, perceived that they made a mistake because they had not used precise language. In the legislation, they essentially had said the word they had not clarified he or she when referring to landholders, property owners who were able to vote. And so there were some women who were able to prove that they owned property, widows and some other single women, because they're married women, the property would still belong to their husband. But so these women were able to take advantage of this loophole, and essentially New Jersey responded by eventually closing the gap and refining the language to restrict voting. And there was at least one other state where that happened. And Rachel can speak to that a little bit more.
Yeah, and so that happened in Utah. Now, it wasn't exactly the founding of our country, but rather at the time, Utah was a territory first. And they did have an amendment to their territorial constitution that gave women explicitly the right to vote as equals to men. And it was actually the federal government that came in and for a number of other reasons that they had issue with the Constitution, they did pull that back. And I guess they pulled some things more in line with what every other state they thought should do, sort of the federal oversights. And then when Utah became a state in 1895, I believe, they again enfranchised women. So that was one of those early Western states. Now, I guess, again, kind of going to that idea of kind of the US government being more, trying to exercise their power over this territory, again, kind of maybe we shouldn't allow that to happen. Maybe we need to pull that back and see how that changes things. So it's interesting how it sort of moves around over the years.
So building on that answer, what U.S. presidents do you feel were supportive of the movement and not supportive?
Well, in sort of post-presidency, Theodore Roosevelt came out in favor of suffrage and is actually quite a vocal suffragist. So much so that if you look at the exhibit, we do in fact have an artifact making fun of Theodore Roosevelt, calling him a suffrage Egypt, you know, kind of colloquial idiot. But that was after his presidency. But there were a number. So let's see. Well, Wilson, that one Nina Allender poster does tell us that he was very much opposed to suffrage. Tiffany, do you want to add to some?
Well, I was going to say the other thing that happened with the presidents and the presidential candidates, Harding, of course, too. What the kind of stories that come out of the study of suffrage is this kind of early lobbying that happens as well. So women are committed from the different suffragist organizations, the national ones, to going into their offices, and they recognize that they have to get in front of them and get them to commit and make a promise. And so with Wilson, they have multiple conversations with him. I think at one point he maybe does commit and then backtracks on that. And so then that's why this like furor happens where they start launching these anti-Wilson campaigns. It's kind of like the ad that we have on the poster. And so that's kind of a ubiquitous story. So it's more, I think that I think the president's role is in the story is that it shows the just more of the strategies that they had to employ in order to make this successful.
So we just had another question come in. The national votes for women trail markers that we see throughout the country. Can you tell us a little bit about those?
I'm actually not super familiar with those, so that's interesting. I know that there was an effort to bring it back to Florida. There is an effort for the Division of Historical Resources, who oversees the marker program for the statewide, to try to identify more sites that could be added to the marker program locally. But I'm interested in hearing more about it. Now this is what happens with this whole the suffrage kind of study and the commemoration. I have about a million things that I need to read and research. Rachel can tell you that I have like 40 always tabs open on my computer where I'm like, this article, I'm gonna grab it later. There's so much good work being done. And so now another one has been added, at least for me. And there is a marker in Fellsmere, which is the location of the first female ballot being cast in Florida. So I do know that for sure. I can confirm that. Rachel, do you have any knowledge of the trails?
Only the Fellsmere edition, and I don't know, it's like maybe a specific national program, but there's also some effort, I believe, from the National Trust for Historic Preservation to identify some of the buildings and places where these significant events are happening. I am not sure that we've had any identified for Florida, but they had a goal, I believe, of 100 as part of the 100-year anniversary.
So fast forwarding to today, what are the statistics on men versus women casting votes? Do we see more on one side or the other, or is it pretty equal?
That is a great question. That is a question for Dr. Susan McManus.
Yes.
Actually, that'll give us time to plug. We're hosting an exhibit, Voices and Votes, in February, and we're going to have a panel including Dr. Susan McManus, who does a lot of research on current voting trends. But in terms of voting in women and men, that's a great question. I do not know the current breakdown. But I do know that.
I read an article the other day that it was about if even actually women just a tad more. But I'm not the expert, but I did read that somewhere recently.
A lot of times I'll say, oh, I read that, and then I realize I've only read like maybe the title of the article, and then I'm like, I'll give you the highlight.
So when will we be able to visit this exhibit? Will it remain up through 2021 to recognize the centennial celebration? And has COVID impacted our ability to visit the museum?
We are currently closed right now to the public due to the pandemic. We've been closed since March 18th. We had a virtual tour last week where I realized it's been 6 months for us. So the exhibit will be up through the end of this calendar year. We can commit to that, and hopefully, you know, there may be an opportunity for the public to see it on site again before then. But we do have to close it in January of 2021 because of Voices and Votes coming. That exhibit was supposed to, it's coming from the Smithsonian and was supposed to be here this previous spring, but then again, because of the pandemic, was delayed. But I think that viewers who would be interested in Rightfully Hers would be very interested in the themes of Voices and Votes, because it also examines voting and democracy and citizenship and all of the issues that are tied into the idea of suffrage. So hopefully, if you can't come for Rightfully Hers, you'll be able to come for Voices and Votes.
Great. So we have a few more minutes. If you're open to it, we have a few more questions.
Okay.
That's great. Our guests today are very inquisitive. Why do you think some states gave women the right to vote before the federal government?
That is an interesting question. We talked a little bit about that, Rachel and I, together yesterday and today, both. It depends. So some places, I can speak to municipalities and why they may do that. So in Florida, and I think this is true for some of the Western states, and Rachel elaborate on that, it was just a consequence of a low population, essentially. And so they had in some places they had to include women, frankly, to have voters because of the low population. In other places, for example, in Florida, the municipal suffrage efforts for voting for local elections, there was definitely a divide between the right to vote at the municipal level, that local level, for school boards, you know, for city government, things like that, boards, advisory citizenry boards, and the notion of voting for president at the general level. So there's definitely a higher comfort, I think, in at the local level, an increased comfort for allowing women to vote in those municipal elections. Also, that's what you could control at the local level, and there's those relationships and connections that made it possible, I think, for people to support their local suffrage bills, for example, in Florida, where they were creating a community and suffrage was part of that. And it's a lot easier to organize on a neighborhood to neighborhood basis than it is to organize on a huge, you know, national basis when people are living miles and miles apart and we don't have the internet, right? So communication is a little bit more difficult, and it's harder to coalesce around the central idea. But Rachel can speak some to what was going on out west and with some of the voting.
Well, Wyoming was the first state to provide that provision in their constitution. And that was, so in 1869, I believe that passed. And there's some, you know, discussion about what were the reasons behind that. And, you know, if you think about it, 1869, that is right in the heart of the Reconstruction period. And I think people don't often think about the Reconstruction really applying that much in the northern and, you know, non-Confederate states. This is, you know, not an issue. But the southern, the northern folks, the Democrats in particular, took issue. You know, I was saying earlier with the 15th Amendment passing, there were a number of people in power who took issue with the idea that people who had been enslaved by them were now allowed to vote, but the women were not. And so it was sort of flipping this idea on its head of you know, who is, again, we're talking about citizenship, who's allowed to be a citizen, so, the 14th Amendment passed just before that 15th, of course, but it was literally a couple of years apart. And I think that sort of influenced a number of people thinking about, well, women should be allowed to vote, white women should be allowed to vote if we're going to allow all these other people to vote. And so there's actually an interesting article I was reading about the Wyoming cases, and I recommend folks go out there and take a look. I know we're kind of limited on time here, but really it does come down to that moment after the Civil War. It does come down to some of those partisan politics and wanting to keep that democratic bloc in power.
Well, thank you so much. We are running out of time, but I want to thank you both again. You've been a wonderful addition to this series that we've been producing to celebrate the women's suffrage 100th anniversary. This information has been invaluable and teaches us great lessons as we forge forward in the future. So thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Absolutely.
And thank you all for joining us today.